Good evening and welcome. I am Michael Kessler, Assistant Director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown, where I am a faculty member in the Department of Government. On behalf of the Berkley Center, I would like to welcome you to this evening's program, The Religious Lives of Political Leaders. The Berkley Center was created in the President's office at Georgetown in 2006 to be a leader in the interdisciplinary study of religion and its role in world affairs. Through research, teaching, and outreach activities, the Berkley Center builds knowledge and promotes scholarly dialogue and public outreach about the global intersection of politics and religion. As we approach the 2012 presidential elections, the Center will sponsor a number of projects exploring the role of religion in U.S. electoral politics. One such event is tonight's panel. In the multimedia realm, we will co-produce with the Program for Jewish Civilization a weekly interview and commentary on faith and politics called The God Vote. It is co-hosted by Jacques Berlinerblau and Sally Quinn, and it resides on the Washington Post On Faith webpage. We also will host a number of online knowledge resources that relate to religion and politics in the U.S. The program this evening is timely for many reasons, not the least of which is the recent midterm election. We have many questions to pose about the moral and religious views of politicians and how their religious convictions and moral convictions shape their legislative and policy choices. Are there limits to this moral and religious influence in a democratic society that safeguards equal protection of law and disfavors so-called establishment? Is it even coherent to conceive of persons acting in the collective without them referencing their ethical ideals? Theologians like Reinhold Niebuhr suggested that individual morality can influence the collective, but in limited ways that only nudge us in the aggregate to less selfish, more moral pursuits. Good Protestant that he was, Niebuhr cautioned constraint. However, he feared, perhaps most of all, the madness in the soul that comes from ethical idealists of every stripe, whether liberal or conservative, who try to institute their personal vision of the ethical ideal into the nitty-gritty, real political order. This illusion, he urges, in Moral Man and Immoral Society is, quote, dangerous because it encourages terrible fanaticisms. Perhaps we won't solve these dilemmas this evening, but our distinguished panelists, E.J. Dionne, Ross Douthat, and Damon Linker, will surely push the conversation forward over the next 90 minutes. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you the panel. E.J. Dionne writes a column for the Washington Post, which is also nationally syndicated in over 90 outlets. That may be actually even more than that. This is a year old. Besides a famous columnist, he is also an accomplished scholar of religion and politics and sometimes sparring partner about political theology with me. He is a university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown, serving in the Georgetown Public Policy Institute and the Department of Government. And he serves as a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution. E.J.'s book, Why Americans Hate Politics, 1991, won the LA Times Book Prize and was a National Book Award nominee. He is also author of They Only Look Dead, Why Progressives Will Dominate the Next Political Era, 1996, Stand Up, Fight Back, Republican Toughs, Democratic Wimps, and the Politics of Revenge, 2004. And in 2008, Sold Out, Reclaiming Faith and Politics After the Religious Right. Ross Douthat joined the New York Times as an op-ed columnist in April 2009. Previously, he was a senior editor at The Atlantic and a blogger for theatlantic.com. He is the author of the 2005 book Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class, and the co-author with Rehan Salam of Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream, 2008. He is a film critic for National Review and has contributed to a number of other outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, the Weekly Standard, the Claremont Review of Books, GQ, Slate, among other publications. In addition, he frequently appears on the video debate site bloggingheads.tv. Douthat graduated from Harvard in 2002. Damon Linker is contributing editor of the New Republic and a senior writing fellow in the Center for Critical Writing at the University of Pennsylvania. He also blogs about religion, culture, and politics for the New Republic. His essays and reviews have appeared in places like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Commentary, National Review, and the Weekly Standard. He is the author of 2 books, The Theocons, Secular America Under Siege, published in 2006, and the 2010 book, The Religious Test, Why We Must Question the Beliefs of Our Leaders. From 2001 to 2005, he worked at First Things, first as associate editor, then as the editor of the journal. Prior to joining the magazine, he taught political philosophy at Brigham Young University and served as a speechwriter for Mayor Rudolph Giuliani of New York. Linker studied history, philosophy, and writing at Ithaca College, graduating in 1991. He went on to earn an MA in European history from NYU and a PhD in political science from Michigan State University. A quick word about format. Each of the panelists will speak for about 10 minutes. Damon will go first. He gets a little longer since his recently published book is the primary occasion for this panel. And then the panelists will engage each other in a conversation. After a bit more than an hour, there will be plenty of opportunity for questions from the audience. EJ will be both a participant and serve as a moderator, so please follow his lead in arranging the order of questions. Finally, please make sure that all of your cell phones, Blackberries, and other noise-making devices are turned off so that others' attention is not disrupted. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming first Damon Linker.
Thank you, Michael, for the introductory remarks and also for putting this together. And thank you to E.J. Dionne and Ross Douthat for coming. It's an exciting event. I hope we'll hold your attention. It could be interesting. At least we have E.J. here to moderate in case Ross and I, come to blows. He's right there in the middle. No, that's great.
And I'll be fair and balanced in exactly the meaning of that word that phrase as it's come to be understood.
Excellent. That's all I ask. Our saints will not be statesmen, and our statesmen will not be saints. That's the penultimate sentence of my book, The Religious Test, and it nicely encapsulates my argument in a single statement. And here's another way to summarize it. Liberal democratic government is a very great good, and so is serious, deep religious faith. But not all good things go together, and these two certainly do not. It seems to me that the religious right actively denies this claim. It wants to say that religion and politics harmonize really quite well, and thus that politicians should place their religious convictions at the core of their identities and at the center of their political campaigns. The religious test that I talk about in the title of the book refers first of all to this claim about the harmonious character of politics and religion, which I believe tests our political institutions and tests are the political norms of liberal democratic government. But the title also refers to how I think our political culture should respond to this view of the religious right, this view about the harmoniousness of religion and politics, and that is by developing a religious test for political candidates. Now, this is not the kind of test that is proscribed rightly in Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution. This is the article that states that you may run for office in our country while belonging to any church, and also you may not be excluded from running for belonging to any church. So it goes positively and negatively. In other words, you can't have a requirement that say you're a member of the Anglican Church, as some of the founding fathers were concerned about. That is un-American and not in the Constitution. It's forbidden and very good. That's a very, very good thing. The religious test that I'm talking about has to do with a kind of informal attempt of engaged, informed citizens to ask tough, pointed, intelligent questions of the religious beliefs of our would-be political leaders. Now, I would say that these should be politically relevant aspects of religious beliefs. So I'll give you kind of first a negative example. In the run-up to the last presidential election, Jacob Weisberg, a columnist and editor of Slate magazine online, wrote a very critical column about Mormonism, about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in which he mocked Mormon religious beliefs, including the fact that most observant Mormons wear sacred undergarments. Now, I would say that that is something that's politically irrelevant. It doesn't matter what Mormons do with what they wear under their clothes. I can't think of any way that this would have a political effect. So that really is, I think, not only in bad taste, but inappropriate. That is not what I'm talking about. I would say that, on the contrary, though, Mormons do have views that would be very interesting and I think actually imperative for us as informed citizens to raise and talk about if Mitt Romney runs again, as we expect him to, or any other candidate who happens to be a member of the LDS Church. So, for example, devout Mormons believe that the head of their church is a living prophet of God. That means that they believe that the head of their church, unlike the other 300 million of us in the United States, has a direct line to God. Members of the Mormon Church have called this prophet God's mouthpiece on earth. What would it mean to have a president who believed that 1 out of 300 million Americans and 1 out of 6 billion human beings on the planet has a direct line to the deity? It doesn't mean anything necessarily strange or troubling would happen, but it's an interesting question, and it's one that I think that informed citizens should be interested in asking. Similarly, Mormons believe, or at least many Mormons believe, this doesn't rise as much to the status of a doctrine, but it is very much kind of part of Mormon folk belief, that the Garden of Eden existed in Jackson County, Missouri, not somewhere else, perhaps in Africa or the current Middle East, as a lot of scholars would think today, but that it was on this continent, in what would be this country. And they often believe that when Jesus Christ returns as part of the second coming, he will rule the world from the territory of the United States. This has led to other folk beliefs on the part of many Mormons that there will come a time in American history when the Constitution will be, quote unquote, hanging by a thread, and that a Mormon will rise to become president and save the country and redeem the country in the name of Jesus Christ. Orrin Hatch, when he was running for president about a decade ago, made reference to this on a Utah radio station, talking about, I've never seen it so bad with the Constitution hanging by a thread. I think that is perfectly interesting, legitimate question to ask. But this raises things far beyond Mormonism. My book is not about Mormonism. I simply use those examples because they're particularly vivid, and I find that many Americans don't know these details about members of the LDS Church. But I don't want to be ganging up on them. I would say on the latter issue, the issue of sacred history, many Christians have views that I think are troubling enough that we should be asking very pointed questions. For instance, Mike Huckabee and Sarah Palin probably will be running for president in the next cycle, over the next 2 years. Mike Huckabee is a Baptist minister. Sarah Palin is a Pentecostal. Many members of those churches believe that many members believe that God guides America's role in the world. Many, members of other churches believe that as well, but many members of those specific groups go on to believe that we might be approaching the end times very soon, that America's role in the world might have implications for the Middle East and when Jesus will come, and that maybe God is guiding America's actions in the Middle East in how we support Israel, how we confront Iran, and that this might have implications for all of human history because of the imminent return of Christ. Does Sarah Palin believe this, for example? Does Mike Huckabee harbor suspicion about the findings of science, about evolutionary biology, as many members of his church do, the Southern Baptists? So these are the kinds of questions that touch on other groups. But just to show you that I am not beating up on Christians, I would say, I also talk about Muslims. There's a lot of controversy about Islam, especially in the last 6 months, controversy about, building mosques at ground zero and so forth. I would say I'm really not concerned about that. I would be much more interested in a Muslim candidate's view of Sharia law. Not that I think any Muslim candidate would run in this country on a platform of imposing it here, but Sharia law and its place in pluralistic societies is a very pressing, very interesting question around the world. In Europe, where there are many more Muslim immigrants than there are in this country, and where they tend to be more politically radicalized than they are here. And then throughout what is referred to as the Arab Muslim world, and then the Muslim world more generally, this is, you could say, the fissure that defines the Muslim world, and that leads to tensions, often very bloody tensions within the Muslim world today. Where do you stand on Sharia law, and should it be something privately held, publicly imposed, under the threat of punishment by the state? Very important questions, perfectly legitimate. And just to show you, I'm not even anti-religious per se. I actually, I beat up a little bit on the new atheists in the book as well. I have a chapter about people like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Sam Harris for what I call their illiberalism on a lot of these matters. In my view, their position amounts to being a kind of counter-religion that has many of the problems of the very fundamentalist types who they oppose. So, for example, Richard Dawkins opens a chapter of his book, The God Delusion, by saying that that he believes that raising a child within a faith community, and he's talking about Catholics at this moment, is a form of child abuse. He then, instead of, if you simply assume that this is, he's just kind of playing to the bleachers here, he doesn't really mean this, he goes on for about 10 or 15 pages to quote psychologists to back him up on this, although he never lets the other shoe drop to say, well, wait a minute, when you're accused of abusing children, the state can come in and arrest you, and the state can take your children away for their own protection. And most of us think this is a very good thing. Does Richard Dawkins actually believe that the state should go into the homes of religious believers and take their children to protect them from the religious education their parents are imposing on them? I don't really think, if push came to shove, he would support this, but clearly the implication of his argument is there. So all of these things, I think, are examples of, you could say, potentially failing what I call the religious test. So I would say, in closing, again, I want to leave my remarks fairly short so we have plenty of time to discuss. My view is that all of this, what I just said, these views and others that I talk about in the book, should be on the table for public discussion and scrutiny. But I want to be clear that my argument is very much a reaction to the rise of the religious right. They are the ones who have put religion on the table in the first place. They can't have it both ways. You can't insist that we should be bringing religion into our public life and then claim that religion should be given impunity from public scrutiny, which I hear happening a fair amount. And journalists go along with this. Ever since John Kennedy, faced criticism about his Catholic faith back in 1960, journalists have thought that it's perfectly okay to be very critical and sometimes mocking and denigrating to religion in general. But when it comes to a serious investigation of particular religious beliefs, particular religious convictions, they get very skittish. Part of this is because of to be honest, kind of ignorance on their part about exactly what religion is, what religious people think, because journalists tend not to be very religious and perhaps don't even know that many people who are devout. But that shouldn't be an excuse. I would say that in a country where there is an active political movement of religiously committed traditionalist believers, these beliefs need to be examined, and our citizenship, in healthy, informed, active citizenship requires it. If, on the other hand, religious believers want a free pass and don't want to be asked these kind of tough, again, respectful and intelligent but tough questions, then maybe they shouldn't push quite so hard to bring that faith so aggressively into the public sphere. So that's I guess, a synopsis of where I'm coming from, and let's start the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Damon, for the opportunity. You've cheated a little bit in your opening remarks because you haven't really said anything that I disagree with too fundamentally. So I'm going to take the liberty in my response of issuing a somewhat prejudiced summary of things you have said elsewhere, which you can then defend yourself against my calumny. Okay. But to begin with, I mean, I think I applaud I applaud Damon's argument in the broadest form, because in the broadest form, I think it's a recognition of a very important point, and a point that a lot of Americans are uncomfortable with, and I think, as you said, a lot of American journalists in particular are uncomfortable with, which is the reality that theology has consequences. I think that there is an idea that's sort of symptomatic of modern liberal society, that theology is something that it's possible to simply, well, on the one hand, that it's something that's possible to simply bracket completely from public discussion, political discussion, and so on, and that people can be sort of theological in the privacy of their own homes, and that never has spillover effects for public life. And I think that's not true in general. It's certainly not true of politicians. And I think that for that reason, the theological beliefs of a person running for high office in the United States should always be on the table. And going through on the table for discussion, and going through Damon's list of examples of situations where a politicians' religious beliefs should be discussed, questioned, debated, argued over, and so on, I basically agreed with most of them. But I'll actually start with a older example, which is one with particular relevance for, well, EJ and I, this university, and so on, which is the case of Catholics in the United States. I think Catholics in America operated for a very long period of time under an intense cloud of political suspicion, and this suspicion was motivated in part by flagrant and outrageous bigotry, but it was also motivated in part by perfectly reasonable concerns about the teachings of the Catholic Church, the role of the Catholic Church in European politics in the 18th and 19th century, and the compatibility of devout Catholic belief with the institutions of American liberal democracy. And I think that historically the challenging of individual Catholics, Catholic populations, and Catholic politicians on exactly these questions, on questions of, well, the Pope's comments about liberalism, what do you make of those? How do your views of the authority of the papacy interact with your American patriotism, and so on? Those were important questions to ask, and they were actually tremendously fruitful questions to ask. I think a large part of the story of contemporary Catholicism's gradual acceptance and accommodation with modern liberal democracy was driven by American Catholics in particular, who recognized the challenge that, recognized the gauntlet that was being thrown down often by Protestant Americans, and built up a kind of intellectual Catholic defense of liberal democracy that culminated in certain respects with the Second Vatican Council's declarations on religious liberty and so forth. So I think that the story of modern Catholicism has been shaped largely in positive ways by some of the challenges that the sort of 19th century versions of the challenges that Damon is talking about today. And then going through some of his more up-to-date examples, I think, I think you can sort of, I think there is a bit of a fine line here, and I think Damon would acknowledge as much. It isn't always clear where you're asking someone about their religious beliefs because those religious beliefs might bear on American politics, or you're asking them about their religious beliefs because you think those beliefs are weird and strange and bizarre and should be made fun of. And I think that in the case of Sarah Palin, I think the media has sort of been on both sides of this line at various times. I think that Damon's right that there are elements in modern Pentecostal theology that have political implications that are worth discussing, but there are also sort of journalistic efforts in the coverage of Sarah Palin that are basically like, people speak in tongues at Sarah Palin's church. Isn't that really weird? And I think that there has to be, if we're going to have a serious discussion about religious beliefs in the public square, people have to be capable of making the distinction between religious beliefs that really don't have public policy implications and religious beliefs that might actually have public policy implications. And I think also you have to be willing in those kind of discussions to consider the kind of politician that you're talking about. I think as late as the early 1960s, there were Catholic politicians in America who deserved Protestant suspicion on the grounds of the compatibility of their faith with liberal democracy. I don't think John F. Kennedy was actually one of them, and I think everyone close to John F. Kennedy pretty much knew that. And I think actually the same may be true of Mitt Romney today. I think some of the questions that Damon raises about Mormonism and politics are valid and interesting and important questions. I'm a little bit skeptical that they're valid and interesting and important questions in the case of Romney himself, but we can go back and forth on that a bit. So I guess where I part company with Damon is something that he sort of gestured at towards the end of his remarks, but what I think is his belief that what he describes as traditionalist religions pose a particular challenge to sort of the liberal bargain, right? The idea that we're going to, and here again I'm going to sort of paraphrase Damon a little bit, but the idea that basically modern liberal politics succeeds by bracketing certain questions about sort of ultimate ends, you might say, sort of bracketing those questions, consigning them to private life, and deliberating publicly on a more limited set of questions, and thereby creating a space in which the sort of ultimate metaphysical, supernatural claims of religion don't have as much bearing and trespass at their peril and everybody's peril. And Damon further argues, I think, that it's easier to imagine what he calls liberal religion, which he sometimes sort of conflates a bit with American civic religion, but I'm sorry to be sort of badly summarizing you, but basically the idea, right, that there is sort of a sort of small L liberal religiosity that is compatible with this liberal bargain because it tends itself to bracket some of these sort of ends-based and some metaphysical claims, supernatural claims, and so on, and that therefore we should worry much more about the traditionalist Catholic, the conservative evangelical, the traditionalist Muslim, the conservative Mormon, then we should worry about the liberal Catholic, the liberal Protestant, and so on. And that therefore, as a corollary, that the rise of the religious right poses a particular challenge that's maybe not unique in America's history, but certainly unique at the present moment. And I think that this is mistaken for a number of reasons, and I'm just going to throw out a couple here, and then we can sort of mix it up a little bit. One reason is that I think that it underestimates the sort of broad dangers associated with liberal religion historically. And because I think that it's absolutely the case that we began with a quote from Niebuhr about sort of the dangers of messianism and proselytism and all the rest of it. And it's absolutely the case that traditional religion mixed with politics can pose those kind of dangers. But it's also been the case historically that liberal religion mixed with politics poses those kind of dangers and can pose them almost at times to a greater degree precisely because liberal religion tends to purge itself of sort of metaphysical claims, eschatological concepts, a belief perhaps in the supernatural, a belief in the afterlife, and so on. It often then tends to channel religious zeal more fully into politics and then more fully into a kind of political utopianism than traditional religion itself. And I think that, we can talk about the extreme examples of this in the history of communist and socialist governments around the world, but I think it's visible in a more tangible and immediate way in the history of American military adventurism. I think that there is a bright line that runs from Woodrow Wilson's views of America's mission to bring democracy to the world and George W. Bush's view of America's mission to bring democracy to the world. And that line is religious, but it is not religious in what I think many traditionalist religious believers would understand. And I think that it's interesting if you look at the liberal and secular response to the Bush era and to Bush's foreign policy, there was what I think was an inordinate amount of attention paid to the impact of sort of evangelical apocalyptic theories on Bush's foreign policy, right? That Bush had invaded the Middle East because he thought it was going to, hasten the rapture or accord with the book of Revelation and so on. But when in fact, I think that Bush, to the extent that you can find a religious imprint on some of the foreign policy mistakes of the Bush presidency, it is in a sense Bush's liberal religious side. It's the same side in a way that led him to sort of ideas about compassionate conservatism and that led him to the more sort of liberal side of his domestic policy agenda. It's ideas about God's purposes being worked out in the secular realm rather than in the next life or at the apocalypse or what have you, that I think has led often in American history to hubris and error and folly. So that would be one point I think that we can go back and forth on a bit. And the other point is just simply as maybe you might expect, I reject the premise that it is possible to sort of maintain a pristine, pure, liberal space with the sort of questions of ultimate ends pushed to the side. And I think to the extent that the American liberal experiment has worked, it's not because of this space was created, secular utopians were pushed out on this side, religious utopians were pushed out on that side, and we all sat around and just deliberated about the design of the healthcare bill. It's because actually you've had a constant clash, a push and pull between different religious factions, different secular factions, all of whom had sort of ultimate ends-based views in mind. And the genius of the American experiment is that it created room for them to balance each other out. And so you have, cycles in one direction creating a reaction in the other direction. You have periods of religious fervor on the left. You have periods of religious fervor on the right. You have periods of secular overreach and so on. But I think the idea that you're going to create this pristine space is doesn't accord with our history, and I don't think it's possible even in theory. And I think you can see this in the debates that we're having today. If you look at, there are clearly cases where the flashpoints of conflict that the religious right is invested in are cases where they are trying to take a conservative Christian morality and use the mechanisms of the law to impose it on secular or liberal Christian fellow citizens. But there are also tons of cases where the religious right itself is a reaction to the imposition of secular or liberal Christian or liberal whatever religion you care to name values on conservative Christians themselves, and it's very difficult to it's easier to imagine in theory than to have in practice the kind of perfect neutrality that I think Damon sometimes imagines. And I mean, if you look at a debate over sex education, for instance, in America's schools, what's going on in that debate? It's a war. It's a war between people with different moral values about sex for control of a space in American life that educates the next generation of Americans. And there isn't, I think ideally you could actually imagine a public school curriculum that sort of took a completely hands-off approach to some of these questions, but imagining it ideally is very different than putting it into practice. Or similarly, the debate, if you look at the debate about gay marriage, right? Yes, in certain ways it's possible to say, well, the state should be neutral, and neutrality means not imposing conservative Christian morality, and therefore we'll allow gay marriage and so on. But in practice, the next thing you know, you're saying, well, and by the way, the Catholic Church with its conservative views, we can't really have them running an adoption agency because they're going to be discriminating against gay people. And then it's, well, maybe you can't have conservative Christian parents maybe aren't fit to be adoptive parents because they hold bigoted views about gays and so on, and those slopes are always there, and it's very difficult to get away from them into a sort of a more pristine realm. So I've rambled much too long, and I've spoken for Damon much too much, but hopefully those are some provocations to get the discussion going.
I just have to report that when Damon spoke of Richard Dawkins saying that raising children as Catholic was a form of child abuse, Ross leaned over and said, "Tell me about it."
But actually, I was a convert to Catholicism at 17, so the joke doesn't even work.
But see, I was raised Catholic.
So I was reaching out. Yeah.
I have often said that I believe the church's job in politics is to make people of all political views feel guilty about something, which proves that I was raised Catholic. I also want to say I love teaching at Georgetown because it constantly reminds you of how many young people are smarter than you are, smarter than I am. So it perfectly prepared me for this panel. And because I embarrassed him once today and it was fun, I have to do it again. Many of you may not know that the winner of the post-pundit of the World's Greatest Pundit competition is a graduate student in our government department, my TA, and my religion and politics course, Connor Williams. So I think we should all be very proud. And I was very happy about this for two reasons. One is I thought Connor really deserved to win, and he is a wonderful person. But two, in the middle of this competition, I actually got a call from an editor who said, look, there are 3 left, or 4 left, and we'd like you to judge this. And I said, I can't possibly do that because when my TA is in the competition, he said, well, if he doesn't make it to the next round, then you can do this. And I said, sure. And then I prayed that she wouldn't rig the competition so that I would have to. And so I'm very grateful to Connor because of all the votes you got. I never had to engage in any of that work. But I think it's wonderful to have him here. I want to just put the Gene Elshane on our faculty once said very well that separation of church and state is one thing, separation of religion and politics is something entirely different. And I think that's part of the problem we're trying to confront here. In American political life, there are some of the most wonderful stories about the odd and sometimes amusing ways in which religion and politics interact. Reinhold Niebuhr tells a great story during the 1928 campaign when Al Smith was coming under all sorts of attacks for what the Vatican had said and for this encyclical and that encyclical. And one day at a meeting of his advisors, Al Smith looked at them and said, would somebody just tell me one thing, what's an encyclical? There is another story of John Kennedy being at a meeting with Arthur Schlesinger and Ted Sorensen, both Unitarians, and they had written this speech for him that was so incredibly Catholic to a Catholic group. And Kennedy looked at the speech and said, this speech is so Catholic, only Unitarians would write a speech like this. Sometimes I believe I'm the only Protestant in the room, said John Kennedy. Then there is Mario Cuomo, who once told the story of a member of the Albany political machine who was a very devout Catholic, would go to the cathedral in Albany every day to Mass, and he would always say the same prayer. It was, "Dear Lord, give me health and strength, I'll steal the rest." Lastly, I have always believed that these matters are, the best story is about Huey Long. Huey Long, when he was running for governor, the Catholic vote, as many of you know, is very important in Louisiana. And he went all over Catholic parts of the state, sort of telling voters, I'm a Baptist, as you all know, but my grandparents were Catholic, and every Sunday I would hitch up my buggy and take them to Mass, and then I'd, take them home. And, he won the Catholic vote, probably having more to do with the fact that he said he'd help Catholic schools than this story. But about a month after the election, a friend sort of sat down with him at lunch and said, Huey, I didn't know your grandparents were Catholic. And Huey Long replied, hell, I didn't even own a buggy. These matters have been dealt with in less profound ways than Damon deals with them in his book. I think the classic sort of case, and I want to, in the end, I want to raise two issues with Damon. But I think this issue that Damon is talking about here was raised in a fascinating way in the 1999 debate, right before the 2000 Republican primary. Many of you remember that George Bush was asked, the candidates were asked, who is your favorite political philosopher? And George Bush famously answered, Jesus, because he changed my life. And then, of course, what happened is, like dominoes, every one of the candidates fell. Jesus was everybody's favorite political philosopher. But what's often forgotten is when Bush was pressed to explain why Jesus was his favorite political philosopher, he replied, well, if you haven't had this experience, you can't explain it. Now, I called after that debate Father Brian Hare, who, as many of you know, who's my guide on many of these matters, and I asked Father Hare what he made of this, and he did what you might call the half linker on this, or maybe actually he did the full linker, because what he said was very interesting. He said the first half of President Bush's statement, I think, is entirely legitimate because voters in a pluralistic democracy have a right to know if a candidate's public views and his actions or her actions will be shaped by their religious faith. And so it was not only right, but in some ways useful that Bush gave that answer. But he said what was objectionable was the second half of the answer, where Bush did not try to explain the implications of this for those parts of the audience that might not have understood what he meant or might not have had his experience. And drawing, I think, a bit indirectly on John Rawls, even though I don't think he is a pure Rawlsian, Father Hare said that there is an obligation in a pluralistic society for people to explain to those who don't share their religious faith how that faith impacts public life. There are two footnotes to that story. One is the best single reply to Bush came from Alan Keyes, whom you may remember was the candidate Barack Obama defeated for the United States Senate. His critique of Bush was very theologically sound. He said, Jesus isn't a philosopher, Jesus is the Word. And the other sort of instant reply that was most effective was from Gary Bauer, where after Bush had said what he said, everybody had to fall in line behind Jesus after that, evangelical Christians being very important in the Iowa caucuses. But what Gary Bauer said was, I was hungry and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. And it was, in a sense, a far better answer than Bush's if you were going to be a Christian, because he instantly explained exactly what his Christian faith meant to what he might be thinking as president. Now, we can debate whether Gary's conservative politics actually would have led to those outcomes, but that's not
clothing, yes.
That's not the purpose of this forum. But I think that is kind of one of the interesting distinctions. Incidentally, I had an evangelical assistant who had no use for Bush in particular. She was a Democrat, but when I made that critique, she critiqued me by saying that I was unfair to Bush because that is the way we talk, meaning evangelicals. And it is, again, the sort of difficulty of bringing religious talk into the public sphere, because in one sense, by Father Hare's strict standards, and I agree with them, there was something wrong with what Bush said in a pluralistic democracy, and yet he was speaking, in some ways that response did speak to a certain authenticity in his evangelical experience. And so then the question becomes, is talking about your religious experience relevant to the electorate? The public has a shrewd and somewhat contradictory view of this, at least according to one of my favorite poll findings, which is the Pew Forum did a survey that asked two questions. One was, I agree, disagree question. I don't like it when politicians say how religious they are. And that split 50 to 45 in agreement, people not liking it when politicians said that they don't like it when they talk about how religious they are. But then when asked, would you prefer to have a president with strong religious beliefs, 70% said yes, which raises the question, if you don't like it when they talk about it, how will you know to answer the 70% question? And yet I always thought that that showed a kind of rough and ready rationality about the core views of Americans on this, which is, A, they don't like people bragging about how religious they are, that they don't trust them, and I don't usually trust people either who brag about how religious they are, but they're also made uncomfortable by it. Yet they were giving a candid, for a lot of Americans, a belief, for a lot of Americans, politicians who have some form of religious belief, and I say this with apologies to Chris Hitchens, they believe that this is a surrogate or an indication of moral standing. Now, again, many of us know folks who claim religious belief who might not particularly fit that category. Nonetheless, that is sort of the division there. There are a couple of questions that I think are raised by Damon's argument. One is whether what he is talking about is actually a religious test at all. In many ways, I think what he is talking about is a secular test to all politicians, believers or not, that has to do with their view of religious toleration and religious liberty. I don't think it is a religious test to ask a politician, do you believe, say, in persecuting or killing those who don't share your faith, to put it at the extreme end. I don't think it's a religious test to ask a candidate, do you believe in religious freedom? I think that we do have every right to know what a candidate's views are on in their attitude about religious freedom. It's not clear to me we need to know a lot more about whether this belief in religious freedom has theological roots or not. I don't think we need to know a lot about the religion of the candidate as long as the candidate makes that assertion. But in a way, that begs the question, and I think the real debate here, and the one in a way I want to kind of encourage between the colleagues to my left and right here, is really, do we have minimalist demands on politicians or maximalist demands? You know, it seems to me that the minimalist demand in a liberal democracy is you must believe in religious freedom and toleration. But do we also ask, there is a limit on how your religious views can influence your policies on a whole series of issues, abortion or poverty or same-sex marriage. At what point is it illegitimate for a public figure to have have views rooted in their religious faith, about which they are quite candid to the voters? Would Damon, I believe, might have put a stronger set of demands on politicians in terms of the linkage of their religious faith to what they would do in office. I think Ross would suggest that putting that strong set of demands would be illegitimate. But I want to ask both of them to sort of talk about that. There is one, just on Ross's point about liberal religion, and Jerome Kapulski is here, so he is an expert on this matter, so he might take issue with me on this. But I think Ross has a very interesting point when he argues that liberal religion can sometimes be more accommodationist to evil than illiberal religion. There is a very interesting book. This is a very controverted area in the study of religion and the Third Reich. There's a very interesting book called The Holy Reich, which makes the argument that certain forms of liberal Protestantism in Germany were more accommodationist to Hitler than certain of the more traditionalist forms. Parts of the confessing church, because of their interpretation of their Christian faith, were actually more resistant to the Nazis than certain liberal forms of faith. Catholics who, in my view as a Catholic, ought to have provided much more resistance to Hitler, nonetheless had moments of resistance, at least around issues such as euthanasia. But I think this is an interesting question for Damon to deal with in terms of what is the relationship between what you might call religious religious liberalism and accommodationism. And there's one point where I simply disagree with Damon, and it's odd coming from me because my disagreement in a funny way would appear to come from the right. It's when I'll attack you later. There's a passage where you talk about abortion, and I do think we probably should have a conversation about what that means, but I'm quoting from Damon, where the church's uncompromising position on abortion runs into political problems is in its demand under threat of ecclesiastical penalty that Catholic politicians oppose and work to deny the political freedom of female citizens to choose an abortion, despite the fact that the United States Supreme Court has declared it to be a constitutional right. It's that italics I disagree with. I believe there is a deep problem for the church when it denies communion or tries to impose certain forms of ecclesiastical discipline on American Catholic politicians, in part from the church's own point of view. It will make it increasingly hard for Catholics to get elected to office, particularly if they are Democrats. But I also think it raises some serious...
Like a tragedy.
What?
No, sorry.
Yeah,
it sounded like
that
a
was
tragedy.
That was his sort of conservative Tourette's moment.
Sounded odd moments.
But I think that and I cannot say that I would oppose excommunication in all forms. I wish the church had excommunicated Hitler. I probably would have cheered when the church excommunicated Leander Perez, the great Southern segregationist, who then went on to say he was going to form his own church called the Presbyterians. But I think in this case, I think there's a wide range of prudential judgments. Similarly, I think where the bishops taking a stand that interpreting the language of the healthcare bill and saying that their sort of view of the language of the healthcare bill was binding on Catholics seemed to be an extraordinary claim that went well beyond what bishops had done. Nonetheless, on this particular point that Damon makes, I disagree. I don't quite get why, just because the Supreme Court took a position, there is something wrong with someone opposing this court view. I can think of a number of Supreme Court decisions that I believe are profoundly wrong. Obviously, right to lifers always point to Dred Scott. I don't think anyone has been as critical recently of the Citizens United decision. I simply don't believe, as an American, let alone as a Catholic or a believer, that there is any obligation to believe that the Supreme Court is right. Many of us had a problem with Bush v. Gore as well. And so I'm curious about that formulation, because I think it offers, an enormous amount of power to the Supreme Court in a democratic republic that I think, I simply disagree with that approach, and I'd like you to talk about it. I think that I go back and want to close with Gene's line, separating church and state is one thing, separating religion and politics is another. My fear is that all of us are guilty of, again, that good Catholic word, are guilty of a lot of picking and choosing, which is why I salute you for trying to systematize this. I have a feeling that many of us welcome religious voices as prophetic and essential when we agree with them, and condemn them as meddling and theocratic when we disagree with them. I think religious people, I take a more minimalist approach. I think that a belief in religious tolerance, openness, and religious freedom is sufficient, and I think we can argue about all the rest, whether they own the buggy or not, whether they steal or not, whether they are too Catholic, they are excessively Catholic Unitarians or not. So why don't you guys take it away, Damon, and then we could have an exchange between these two, and then, as I say, now I will turn fair and balanced, and hopefully I moderate a discussion. And if no one puts their hands up, I have a lot of friends in this audience, and I will turn to them to jump in. But I think several of them are eager to join. Do you want to reply to both of us, maybe, and then we'll go to the audience, and then Ross can intervene.
Sure, I'll say a few words. Is this on? Yeah, okay. Great, thanks both of you. That was lots to reply to. Let's see. I guess I'll take your objection to the abortion paragraph first. I guess, maybe I should, if the book comes out in paperback, maybe I'll look to reword that paragraph, because I've had a couple of other people point to that as being problematic. My point there, perhaps very badly stated, was simply, I think that the church errs and goes too far when it demands that Catholic politicians of either party, because there are a fair number of pro-choice Republicans as well, insist that they not only not have abortions, not encourage people to have abortions, not drive people to have abortions, not pay for people to have abortions, not support public funding of abortions. These are all things that I think would be perfectly legitimate for the Catholic Church to do. I frankly just don't understand. To me, there's a very large leap from all of those things to the insistence that a Catholic politician must seek to make it illegal for everybody. I think that it's perfectly fine to think abortion is an abomination, to oppose it, to say that if you're a Catholic, you are expected never to have one, never to encourage one, and all the other things. Makes perfect sense to me. It does not make sense to me for the church to insist that a Catholic politician must work to make it illegal. And maybe in that sense, that obviously opens up a whole other can of worms that people will disagree with, but perhaps that points to the fact that I should never have even brought the Supreme Court in there, that's not really what I'm talking about. Because the issue that really, I think, matters to me and is significant for the issue is the one I just raised.
Can I ask a question there on that point? Do you think that there are moral / legal and political issues where it is justifiable for the Catholic Church to take that? Well, I mean, obviously you do, because you just suggested that it would be okay for the church to excommunicate a politician who voted to massively fund abortion and so on. But do you think, but I mean, obviously you're familiar with the counter-argument, which is that if we lived in a society where it was legal to murder Jews based on your personal choice, that it would presumably be legitimate for the Catholic Church to take the stance that, that politicians who had voted for Supreme Court justices who had decided the Roe versus Wade of this Jew-killing society, that it would be permissible for the Catholic Church to excommunicate those politicians, right? So so essentially you are making the distinction that you do not think that abortion rises to the level of moral gravity that the Catholic Church thinks it does, right?
I am saying that and this goes to the heart of kind of what, in chapter 5 of the book is where I kind of really dig into the whole, the issues of the culture war, abortion and same-sex marriage. And this is where, this actually is a good opening to one of the main points that Ross made about, is it possible to have a kind of pristine public square in which you've kind of expunged religion? That isn't, my current position isn't quite that stark, but on this issue, maybe it sounds like it is inevitably, that I believe that there is sufficient lack of consensus about the moral status of abortion as an act, that the church should make a distinction between saying, if you're a member of this church, it is incumbent upon you to affirm this moral view as true. But it's a very different thing, and as I said before, a much bigger leap to say that this non-Catholic society, not anti-Catholic, but not Catholic society, to expect that Catholic politicians endorse, that this society as a whole endorse the Catholic position on this, is a kind of a step too far.
So would you be opposed to, I'm sorry to pressure you, but it's a sort of important point, would you be opposed then to the idea of a Catholic archbishop in, say, the South of the 1920s excommunicating a openly segregationist Catholic politician? Because clearly in that case there was certainly no moral consensus on the question of segregation in the southern United States down, into the second half of the 20th century, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, at what point is there really no, should we say, prophetic role for a Christian institution to play in sort of how it, and again, these are sort of, it's not as if the Catholic Church is advocating that the police power of the state be used to tear John Kerry away from the communion rail, right? The Catholic Church is merely sort of setting discipline for its own members in a voluntary organization, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I feel like asking Ross, did you do debate at Regents? But that's the right question.
Well, Damon, people should know, Damon and I have been having this argument online in various forms and forums for about
5 years.
5 years.
Yeah.
So I've been eagerly awaiting this chance to have him in the flesh in front of me. But
yes.
All right. But that's my last.
And then I'm going to throw one at you, and
okay.
then we will open it up to the audience. Where this is sort of falling into one of my pet peeves. Why is it that whenever we talk about Catholics in public life, we end up arguing about abortion? But anyway, go ahead, Damon.
Yeah.
Reply to
yeah, I do want to say one more thing about abortion after I answer the segregation question. In general, I think it's from the point of view of liberal politics. I think it's a bad idea. I think that there are different issues that you can construct an argument, and I would want to try to do one that says that, well, the status of a living, breathing human being is actually, the underlying principle is not as metaphysically contentious as the issue is in abortion.
Right.
And so you could make a distinction there. But in general, I do believe that religious leaders should be restrained, that should be kind of the default position.
See, I think one of the curious things about our discussion is, in a funny way, it's possible that Ross and I agree, at least in part, in seeing your argument as excessively privatizing religion. Do you think that's a possibility? Because Damon, to his credit, can be pretty tough on the religious left as well as the religious right. But
that's accurate, I think. And the funny thing is, though, I think one of you, I forget who it was, probably Ross, I referenced that the two of you were kind of together as the Catholics here. I'm a Catholic too, by the way, just to get it on the record. This is
one of the things I've been trying to get on the record for like 5 years now.
But I'm not as
it's
good
being
of a,
taped
I'm
too,
not
so
as
done.
good of a Catholic as these two. But I am a Catholic.
I'm not going to make that.
You haven't read the comments on my blog post recently.
Let me ask Ross, because I can't resist a question I once asked a bishop on abortion, which is, imagine two circumstances. Imagine we could have all the data to know what I am about to say, and that we have two choices before us. We can make abortion illegal. And what we learn is that the abortion rate drops only about 25% because of the number of illegal abortions. And in fact, that drop is matched by a comparable number or even half the number of deaths among women who have illegal abortions. So that's path A. Imagine path B, where we do everything we can to reduce the number of abortions, including giving extraordinary aid to women who want to bring their children into the world, give real support to them and their kids. And we discover that this abortion reduction approach And it can include sex ed. It can include, a moral teaching for abstinence. It include a whole package of things that some on the left and some on the right might support. And what you learn is that the abortion rate has dropped 35%. So you have, by the second path, you actually save more lives than by path one. Why isn't the second path better than the first path?
Well, I mean, can we bracket in an extended rant in which I attack the premises of your hypothetical? Just assume a rant against those premises, and then, and well, I mean, because there simply isn't any, there isn't any reason to think that's a fair hypothetical. But in the spirit of, I will say that is not the Catholic position, because Catholics are not utilitarians. And I think that this actually goes to the point that I was making earlier about the fact that public policy and democratic politics are always going to be shaped by clashes of deep moral principles that can't simply, as I was saying, be sort of cleared away to create a pristine space. And I think the history of political debate in the United States has often been driven by a clash between sort of Christian views on the one hand and a more utilitarian idea on the other hand. Where
why is that a utilitarian view?
Because you're essentially saying that you're assessing a legal regime on the basis of whether it produces the greatest. I mean, it's not the greatest happiness for the greatest number exactly, but you're saying
which regime most protects life. Which regime
No, it's not which regime most protects life. The second regime that you've described that gets the 35% reduction in the abortion rate doesn't protect human life at all. I mean, it protects human life in general. It doesn't protect unborn human life. There are no protections.
It protects more.
There are no protections being given. This is the nub of the debate, right? What they're being given are incentives not to do. To commit crime X. It's essentially saying, we won't have laws against murder, but we will have. I mean, if I wanted to caricature the liberalism of the 1960s, I would say we won't have have penalties for murder, but we'll spend a lot of money on social programs. No, I mean but there is, right. I mean, this is in all seriousness, this is a strand in American political argument, and that the point, we don't want to punish too harshly, and we want to achieve the best outcome in terms of overall human welfare, and so the best outcome is your 35% reduction rather than your 25% reduction. But I mean, again, the problem with the abortion debate, right, is that there is no actual analogy to abortion. Right? There is nothing else in human life that is like abortion. There isn't some other situation that's exactly like it. So people on both sides fall back on these. It's like, well, you've got. I mean, I just had my segregation analogy, and I had my Jew killing analogy, and now I'll go to my slavery analogy, and so on. And they're all taken as sort of. I mean, by people on the pro-choice side of the argument, they're taken as offensive and extreme, and so on. And in certain ways, they are offensive and extreme. And the problem is there aren't other analogies. There aren't other analogies to work with. But I mean, with that caveat, I mean, it's like, in the argument about the abolition of slavery, right? There is an extended case often made by apologists for the Confederacy that the Civil War was a terrible mistake, and that, if you look at, given 25, 30 years and so on, slavery would have gradually ceased to exist. People would have bought their way out of slavery. The institution wouldn't have been economically viable anymore. And, here we would be today without the trauma of the Union dead and the Confederate dead and the legacy of Reconstruction and so on. And that we didn't need, that the abolitionists were just crazy moral absolutists, right? And that the greatest good for the greatest number would have been achieved through other means. And I mean, this is a thing with religious people, right? They often are crazy absolutists. But anyway, I'm sorry. We've taken ourselves.
See, I want to argue with you about the Civil War, which is, just to make the brief point, and I will drop it, I'll save you my rant, but that the reason the Civil War happened is because the Southerners feared that slavery was on the road to extinction, and therefore they had to separate from the Union in order to protect slavery. Remember who fired on Fort Sumter, even if Lincoln was shrewdly set it up so that was going to happen. But the South did not have to secede, and they seceded to prevent slavery from gradually dying out. Lincoln was willing to let it gradually die out. But this is far beyond, well, it's not actually
I think
disconnected.
Damon had a further point before we went into our board.
don't remember what
You
it
don't
was.
remember what it was.
Who wants to join this fray, this entertaining
should-
fray?
we should pull it back.
Mike Kazin? Patrick, do you want to come in? Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
See, I want you to consign us both to hell in the course of your question, but Mike,
One quick
politely.
question. Really more for Damon than anybody else. First, Jesus was Eugene Debs' favorite philosopher too. Sorry.
This is Mike Kazin, the distinguished history professor here who wrote the best book on William Jennings Bryan. Everybody should know. Everybody should read his book.
Thank you, Jay.
It's
I just want to make one comment. I just made it without amplification. Jesus Christ was Debs' favorite philosopher too. Eugene Debs' favorite philosopher too. And at one point, that comment that he's my favorite philosopher would have been completely uncontroversial. You know, I think it's only since World War II that it got less controversial. And the question I have, you know, I'm intrigued by the idea of your religious test. I haven't read the book yet, but I have a question about sincerity.
Yes.
That is, you know, I can imagine, you know, these questions being put to various people, and their answer being a close approximation of Dwight D. Eisenhower's famous or infamous comment about, you know, our republic depends on a profound religious feeling or sentiment, and I don't care what it is, you know. And what would you do with that? That is, yes, you could say, Romney could say, I'm a devout Mormon. Other people can say they're devout Catholics or evangelical Protestants. Maybe harder for Huckabee, who is actually a minister, to get away with that. But still, I'm sure that asked that question, if he is asked that question or will be asked that question, he would squirrel away from it as well. The implications. So what do you do with that problem?
Thanks. Well, I mean, in a way, a politician who's willing to, if you will, BS his way through a question like that actually is a politician who isn't really worrying me very much. I mean, in some ways, my posing these questions, you could say, is kind of it's an attempt to be a kind of troublemaker. I don't really think most politicians, especially when you get to high office like the presidency, I really don't think most people who rise to that level of ambition and political success to be within striking distance of the Oval Office are really that devout. I think that politics has a way of kind of educating you very much through firsthand account the ways of ambition and worldly wisdom and so forth. And so I think most of them are BSing already. And they're using that to get votes. And they're using it to get support and so forth. And so if they just keep doing that, then, you know, what am I going to do? I can't see into their souls. I don't know what they truly believe. But if you ask tough, pointed questions about the big issues, the ones that are most potentially problematic, and they essentially say, oh, no, don't worry about that. That's no big deal. Or they redefine their faith so that it has none of those sharp edges, then I say, all right, well, fine. I guess I was wrong to be concerned. There's nothing here at all. And I think that's a useful public lesson for especially for those, and we haven't really gone into this issue about why the religious right is uniquely troubling to me. So maybe that'll come out. But then in a way we've kind of exposed the lie under that, which is that actually most politicians, put their religious faith front and center for the sake of getting votes, but it's not really serious. And I would like to expose that with these questions, if that's what's exposed. And I frankly think that that is the more likely thing to be exposed. And I think that would be very useful in deflating the religious right, to actually show that what you are really accomplishing in our politics is getting politicians to, well, blow sunshine somewhere. So,
I feel like I'm channeling this force field from Patrick and Ross. I couldn't resist asking you the question. So the only politicians you really have a problem with are sincere, devout believers.
well, the book, yeah, in a way. But my book is about traditionalist believers. Yes, people who actually believe. Yeah, and that goes, I guess, maybe why not take up Ross's question about, why the religious right now, why religious liberals? Well, I mean, I do think that I'm trying in this book to be a little bit more nuanced about this than I was in my first book, which seemed to be very much kind of stark opposites, kind of defending a robust separation of not only church and state, but religion and politics. I use the metaphor in the epilogue to the book of a skirmish line, which is, unlike a wall, isn't something that you just build and then either scale or tear down. It's something that moves back and forth and changes throughout history, and depending on the claims of religious believers and those on the other side. And I like that metaphor a little bit better because it does shows more flexibility to this. I'm trying to come up with a series of a lot of ways to try to think through where there are tensions between liberal democratic politics and various forms of traditionalist belief. And those come up more, the tensions come up with traditionalist religious belief precisely because traditionalist believers make robust, strong claims about truth. And liberal democratic society, liberal democratic government is a method for people getting along when they don't all agree about the answer to those truths. And so though both things are good, but they pull in different directions. Now, if you're just a citizen and you're voting and you're participating, writing letters to the editor and so forth, in my current incarnation in this book, I don't really have a big problem in most cases with you bringing your religion with you everywhere you go. But as you ascend the hierarchy toward high office and you come to represent more and more of us in this diverse, pluralistic society, the problems get bigger, the tensions get greater, until when we're talking about the presidency, the tension is most stark, where if you are, that's where the line comes in that I read at the very beginning. Our saints will not be statesmen, and our statesmen will not be saints. If you want to be a saint, you can do a lot of things, but maybe not be president. If you want to be a great statesman, you can be a very good person, but maybe you should, rule out being a saint. But you can do, a little bit of each at lower levels of politics and lower levels of religion. So,
can I just say that I think that in a sense that is a very traditionalist Christian sentiment, the idea that that the vocations of saint and statesman, obviously Christians would say everyone should strive to be a saint, but they are further apart than, say, saint and butcher or baker or candlestick maker. Where I think, and I guess my view tends to be that when Damon picks out real problems, but they're bigger problems for Christians themselves than for the threatened, beleaguered mass of secular or lukewarm Americans. And so in this case, for instance, I think there clearly is a tendency on the religious right in particular, and this was true of liberals with Barack Obama to some extent as well, but to see these sort of political figures as saints, right, as people who simply by virtue of being elected will bring about the moral renewal of society. And you see this in some of the enthusiasm for Sarah Palin. You saw it in some of the evangelical enthusiasm for George W. Bush. But I guess where I part ways is that I think that this tends to be more of a problem for the Christians themselves, because this is a very poor way to advance Christian ideas, because you just end up being disappointed and disillusioned when they turn out not to be saints as well. And I think this is true for liberals with Barack Obama, that, it's not, the danger of sort of liberal messianism around Obama was not that Obama was going to take power and then turn out to be a crazy liberal fascist dictator, right? The danger was exactly what's happened, that Obama built up these unreasonable expectations that have then, led lots of liberals to be, I think, overly disillusioned with him. But again, I don't think that that's I don't think the threat here is the specter of a crazed apocalyptic would-be saint with the reins of power. The threat is more that, people invest more in politics than should be invested in it.
I was thinking somebody would come up to you and say, what's this guy's problem? I've never met a politician who's a saint. End of problem, but it's and the messianism is built up by the supporters more than the individual, although the individual
can play a role.
I think. Jerome and then Nathan, over here.
I'd like to.
Can you introduce yourself just to...
Yeah, I'm Jerome Kapolsky. I teach at Goucher College. And I'd like to move, I guess, from Ross's implied Augustinianism back to what I see as Damon's implied Machiavellianism, which I appreciate very much. And like to move to the use of religious rhetoric on the part of political leaders. That is to say, what happens when you have a good Machiavellian who ascends to high office, who knows in order to enthuse the population, to motivate them to do great things or wicked things, that religious language often is very powerful. And to, in the case of America, to try to reach back or manipulate the very rich tradition of an American civil religion to that end. So not that this political leader is unduly influenced by his or her beliefs, but is trying to marshal the language or the rhetoric of religion to do something politically. Do you consider particular dangers there or particular opportunities there?
Well, here's where I think Ross and I are probably on the same side. I mean, I'm very skeptical of and nervous about messianism in any form. Well, maybe you aren't in certain religious forms.
I'm still waiting for the right Messiah.
Yeah. No, but I was troubled by Obama's self-inflating rhetoric for precisely the same reason. This is just going to end up disappointing people. There's not enough content to this. I don't know what he's talking about. And so I would prefer that he didn't do that. And in general, I would prefer to deflate religion in our public life in all its form, including civil religion, although I will say that my book is not about that. And that's kind of what I would say about Ross's objection about, well, what about liberal Christianity? As I discuss it in passing in the book, liberal Christianity isn't as much of a problem. I don't think the constitutional framers thought it would be a problem. I think they kind of assumed that all religion would become liberal religion and it would be fine. If it becomes civil religion and becomes messianic and wrapped up with a kind of providentialism, then I think it can become a danger in the same way that traditionalist religion can become a danger. So, but my book really isn't about that. I chose to write it about more traditional style believers and what happens when they bring their faith into politics. But I'm definitely on the skeptical, critical side about messianism in any form.
Are you skeptical, Jerome? Or you seem, in a Machiavellian sense, to be speaking positively of the use of religious language.
The people must be, they must be led.
I'm skeptical of it. Thanks. I'm skeptical of it, and certainly I was skeptical of it in, I guess it was 2005 when George Bush made his second inaugural address, which was loaded with this kind of imagery. So much so that even Peggy Noonan got nervous. But at the same time, if you are to undertake a big national project like the Iraq War or like World War II, something that we probably feel more comfortable talking about, can that be done without appealing to sentiments which go beyond the kind of liberal proceduralism that we've been talking about? In other words, can one be involved in what is there necessarily a religious dimension to American patriotism? I guess that's the question.
I mean, I think one interesting way to look at it is that, in a sense, Damon's argument is a brief for a kind of stringent, libertarianism might not be exactly the right word, but a sort of deeply small government vision of America. That in a sense you can imagine, and I shouldn't say in a sense, I mean, basically the smaller your government is, the more I think you can imagine the fewer grand projects, right, that it takes on, the smaller its military, right, the less it goes abroad in search of monsters to destroy, the more you can imagine sort of pushing these questions about ultimate ends to one side. And then the bigger government gets, the more likely it is that people are just going to see government as a realm where they sort of have to fight these kind of ultimate battles. I mean, a lot of, if the public school system if there weren't a public school system in the United States, right, a lot of culture war battles would go away because people wouldn't be so invested in it wouldn't matter whether their government was run by Christians or agnostics, because their government wasn't teaching their children. So, I mean, I think, I'm curious what you think about it.
I know my argument does tend in a libertarian direction. That's true. Although I also do try very hard to be realistic and realize that then we really do get to this kind of like pristine kind of pipe dream vision of America that has very little to do with contemporary America, which is not libertarian in this kind of hyper-federalist sense.
Right.
I mean, I talk about how I want an America where there's Provo and also Provincetown, and that this is a good thing. But I also I don't know. EJ, did you want to jump in?
I just wanted to say I think there is a kind of communitarian liberal critique of your position, the kind of Mike Sandel's critique, which is that you want a liberalism so narrow that you really push large arguments about ultimate ends out of politics altogether. And that's a dangerous. I think that is dangerous to democracy, and I actually think in the long run it's dangerous to liberalism, because it becomes a kind of desiccated liberalism.
Well, I would say my view is that without me or anybody else saying anything, meaning a public intellectual saying anything, Americans by default are kind of really metaphysical in the way they talk about politics. It just it's always there. And so given that, I see my role, very modest, is to try to deflate it a little bit, bring it down, knowing that it's going to fail, but I would rather err on that side than encourage it. And I once, as we all know, I once worked in a world in which the view was inflated, give arguments to say it should be even more that way, and I'm nervous about that. What I was going to say a moment ago, if I could, about trying to be realistic and not too hyper pipe dream libertarian. I mean, one way in which I try to be very fair-minded in the book is I take on the issue of the public schools in my first chapter, and after being kind of very tough on evangelical homeschoolers for being, too traditionalist, radical, scary in the way that I sometimes portray the religious right to be. I then kind of really pull the rug out from under kind of secular liberals at the end of that chapter by in effect saying that, I concede Ross's point that he made in his remarks that, the religious right sees itself as actually responding to an attack by secular liberal ideology. And I say, in effect, if you want to have fewer homeschoolers, which I think we should have, because I think the public schools have a role in trying to inculcate a kind of a common civic identity in Americans, then that civic identity has to be a thin one and not be a comprehensive secular ideology. This public school should not set out to find all the sexual traditionalists in the classroom or those from sexually traditionalist families and try to stamp that out. That as much as possible, and this is of course always what I would say against Ross's claim that this is again kind of a vision of pristine, unmetaphysical politics. My view is actually that yeah, it's going to fail, but the ideal should be as neutral as can be. There will always come up cases on one side or the other where a decision has to be made. Are we going to side with, the the conservative Muslim family that's treating their daughter in a way that, maybe goes too far? Does the public school feel like it has to step in and intervene? And about gay issues and all kinds of things. These are going to be fought out, and the skirmish line will end in one place in Provo and end in a very different one in San Francisco. But that, again, the ideal should be as much as possible to be neutral. That's the idea.
I don't know where we are on time. I see at least 3 people who want to get in. Can I bring you all in? This gentleman in the back has been very patient and insistent, and then Nathan, and you wanted to get in also. Let's have all 3 of you come in, and then the distinguished panelists can reply. I'm talking about them.
I'm Charlie. I'm a senior in the college here at Georgetown. I have a question for the panel at large, but I want to sort of frame it within a more pointed question for Damon. And it was sort of a point of clarification between 2 things you said. At one point, you talked about the fact that you'd have no qualms about a politician who was able to sort of BS his way through as long as he could talk the political language, and he didn't show too much belief or too much strong and firm truth. He didn't make any too strong true statements. And then at the same time, you also said that at base level, liberal democracy, the institutions, the functioning of the institution is the most important thing. So just taking the example of former President Bill Clinton, I think there we have a president who, lied under oath, and that for me raises the question of how important is it that politicians and really, I guess, across that all individuals in our society do have at least some beliefs that when they're taking oaths, otherwise it seems like our legal institutions and the very framework for rule of law sort of breaks down.
Thank you. Hold that thought, and then Nathan?
Mr. Linker, you, I think, kind of nicely illustrated, I'm over here, something I was thinking earlier when you said that in a pluralistic liberal society, we all make sort of controversial and competing truth claims that it's not the job of the state to resolve necessarily. And I think that leads to one of the reasons why there's been such a negative reaction to the Christian right in particular among religious political groups, why they've been singled out, is because they would argue that they do have democratic virtues, but there is something, I think, fundamentally illiberal about wanting to use the law as a statement of moral judgment, which is not something that you find in every religious movement, I would argue. And to go back to one of the back and forths over abortion, but then also over same-sex marriage, it seems to me that an abortion compromise which allows the moral claims of left and right to enter into a broadly sort of widespread attempt to lower the abortion rate allows the moral claims and the sort of metaphysical, philosophical claims of everyone to be involved in the project in order to pursue a fairly commonly shared goal. In the same way that I think that we don't necessarily have to go through the slippery slope on marriage, adoption, et cetera, that you described in order to say that there is a sort of pro-family stance that allows gay marriage, and I know you've dialogued with Andrew Sullivan on this, and so I don't need to explain that argument to you. And so I think, do you think there's something sort of fundamentally illiberal or unfair about saying, heads I win, tails you lose? We can only have my moral statement guide our politics rather than creating a space, as Mr. Linker has described, where various competing moral claims, including those of the religious right, can be involved in a sort of a more communal compromise or a bargain of some kind.
Thank you. And just pass it down.
Yeah, thank you. David Berkley, a PhD student working on religion and politics comparatively here, and just a very brief question. So if I understand, Mr. Linker, your core bargain correctly, it's that by raising the salience to a limited extent of religious issues on the campaign trail, we actually expose the charlatans and somehow reduce the stakes of some of the politicized religion that we've seen. And I'm just curious if you have any sort of empirical evidence that might actually be the case, because I could easily imagine the alternative where by allowing more of these sort of religious tests, right, we encourage the sort of grandstanding and charlatanism that has come to characterize religion on American campaign trails in the past 25 years. And I would worry about that as both a person of faith and a liberal. So.
Thank you. Why don't we let Ross? You haven't said anything for a while.
For a while,
Let's bring you
for
in.
like 30 seconds.
And then I'll let Damon close.
Okay, so I guess I'm persistently, to your question, I'm persistently skeptical of the idea that we can achieve a world where the law is not in one shape or form, you know, an imposer of moral judgments upon people. And I think that this, you know, this is true in explicit ways in the sort of big controversies in American history, like the controversy, you know, the controversy over race. It's true in sort of small bore ways, like the controversies over what do public institutions do and inculcate in citizens and so on. Like, can you really imagine a public school curriculum that doesn't, you know, can you imagine a history textbook, right, for public schools that doesn't implicitly make moral judgments about American history and thus, in some sense, impose them upon the students who attend those public schools? I mean, and the reason, as I was sort of blathering before, I mean, abortion really is distinctive, I think, in a way that some of these other controversies are not. And I think that, again, Damon and I could find a lot of common ground on, you know, there are clearly cases where just sort of taking the temperature down makes a lot of sense. And there are, I think, a lot of cases where the religious right's decision to react to the feeling of being imposed upon by then themselves imposing has reaped a kind of backlash. And I think sex education is actually a great example where there, you know, this sort of, well, we're going to have liberal sex education. No, we're going to have abstinence sex education and so on. Can't we just take the temperature down? Abortion, it's much harder to take the temperature down. And I think it's much harder because it is a case where, you know, there is a sense in which the claim being advanced by my side of the argument is a claim that cuts to the heart of questions that, you know, are the moral premises of our republic. And this is something we haven't really gotten into, but the question of whether even Damon's limited liberalism does not itself have some metaphysical foundations, right? And I think this is a case where a lot of, you know, I mean, and this is actually why religious conservatives have, this is the only issue on which they've probably moved the needle in their direction, because it's a case where the language of rights, the language of liberalism can be used by pro-lifers very effectively for obvious reasons, in a way that isn't the case with gay marriage, isn't the case with pornography, and so on. So I guess, yeah, I have sort of a threefold. One, I'm just skeptical of the premise that, you know, morality and law can ever be completely separated. Two, I agree that there are cases where you can take down, you know, turn down the pressure and, you know, create, if not a pristine political realm, a more pristine political realm. But there I do think you have to be a bit more small government-ish, states' right-ish, and so on to get the temperature down. And third, I think there are distinctive cases like abortion where you just can't. And I should say this doesn't mean that like a pro-lifer can't imagine a political compromise. I think that we have to distinguish between the question of whether, you know, whether you can make compromises on these sort of metaphysical issues that isn't the issue. The question is whether you can advance the claims at all, right? So it's totally, I mean, and I think a Catholic archbishop would say it's totally fine for a Catholic politician to vote for a bill that outlaws third trimester abortions and doesn't outlaw first and second trimester abortions, because politics is the art of the possible and you're compromising. And as Damon says,
Except, just parenthetically, I didn't think of a politician who did exactly that, who was denied communion. So, I mean, it is, there
well,
is a problem here where, in terms of, can you or can you
no,
not
but
compromise?
I'm saying that you can make a, well, what I would say is that you can make a compromise where you achieve the sort of maximal goal possible given the political correlation of forces. And I think that is the sort of reasonable goal of the pro-life movement. You recognize that you're never going to reach a point where you're, you know, or not in the next 15 or 20 years where you ban all abortions or ban all abortions except in cases of rape, incest, and so on. But so you're open to compromises, but you're not compromising on the fundamental point. And I mean, people, yeah, I mean, you might say, well, that's sort of a slippery distinction, and you know, it is. We're talking about politics after all. So, anyway, I'll end there.
I have very little to say to the first and third questions. I'll do those first and then end on the second, because that's also what Ross was, I think, talking about mainly. On the first question about beliefs and the rule of law breaking down, Bill Clinton and his oath and perjury and so forth. I mean, I think that if you're in politics, you're supposed to uphold your oaths. I mean, if you're president, you say an oath to uphold the Constitution, and I think you should be taking that very seriously indeed. I don't think that you need to be a religious believer to do that. I mean, Bill Clinton claimed to be a religious believer. And of course, there was the fact that the lawsuit for which he was being sworn in was a completely politically motivated, it was a setup, in effect, and put him in pretty much an impossible position as the president. So should he have lied under oath? No, but it was as badly political as you can get on every side, I think. And I think that it's perfectly possible for a secular, an atheist to say an oath and uphold it. So I don't think religion is necessary for that. On empirical evidence of how this would it work, what I'm proposing? Of course, I don't have any because it hasn't happened yet. I would say grandstanding, even more grandstanding on the part of politicians is possible. But I would say that it's always possible for a politician. But I would say they're doing it already anyway, and it certainly wouldn't be even if it accomplished nothing else, it might increase theological literacy in the country. I mean, Ross has had Ross had a very good blog post of a month or so ago about that survey showing that no one in America knows anything about any religion, including their own. And I thought it was great. Ross pointed out that, it's one thing to say, it's bad that Catholics don't abide by what the church teaches, but if they don't even know what the church teaches, that's really bad. You can't even say they're bad Catholics, so they don't even know what it would take to be a good one. That's not good. So if what I'm proposing would increase our kind of a civic literacy about religious beliefs, then that in and of itself might make it a good thing. On the last point, the second question about is there something illiberal about moral claims, I try to make a distinction in that chapter that's about the culture war, the distinction between a morality of rights and a morality of ends. And I do think that liberalism tends to slowly, over time, to back away from upholding a morality of ends. Now, there are exceptions. When there is an overwhelming societal consensus about those ends, as there was about sex in this country until around 50 years ago, then the liberal state will impose a morality of ends because 98-point-something% believe it to be true. And this was true in American history up until around 50 years ago, that the overwhelming majority of Americans believed that it was immoral and that the law should back up the immorality by imposing sanction for all forms of sodomy, inside and outside of marriage, oral sex, anal sex, inside and outside of marriage between people of the same gender and different genders and so forth, all down the line. And because there was such overwhelming consensus, the liberal state was perfectly happy to impose this. The thing is that, and this raises all kinds of big questions that I'm sure Ross would want to pounce on me for, but this is really a matter of causality. I know that the religious right is not completely being paranoid when it feels itself put upon, but it is also the case, I think genealogically, if you look at the history, that the consensus broke down first before the law backed away, and the law has backed down from imposing these things because the consensus broke down. And so when the consensus breaks down, the liberal state's kind of default position is to say, whoa, I can't impose this anymore. I have to simply stand back and let you guys decide this in the private sphere. If you want to be a sexual traditionalist, you're perfectly it's perfectly okay to be a sexual traditionalist and to raise your kids that way. That's why I say the public schools should not be trying to completely expunge sexual traditionalism from the minds of the children in their care 6 hours a day, precisely because those traditionalists should be allowed to try to perpetuate it in their families. But the public sphere will not be in favor of, it will not back them up in it anymore. And that is because the consensus has broken down, and the liberal state does not impose in matters where there is not overwhelming consensus about a morality of ends. And that's, in that case, the morality of rights trumps it, and that's still morality. It is a morality, and so I don't usually
Right,
you know,
but don't you see that the morality of rights is itself, in a sense, a morality of ends? I mean, historically, if you look at, the reason, abortion is still contested, right? And but if you look at, the morality of rights in the case of race, right? It's yes, sure, you are allowed to be a racist in American life, but you aren't really allowed to be a racist, and we think that's a good thing, right? You are discriminated against in any attempt to sort of put your racism into. And I'm sorry.
Well,
I think that
abortion isn't a great case to debate on this issue precisely because abortion is a clash between two competing
so bracket abortion
rights
and
claims.
just look at homosexuality, right?
Yes.
You start out by saying there is a right to choose your own sexual partner, right? So it's a morality of rights. We aren't judging one way or another. But don't you think that American society is moving in the direction where the right to have a spouse of the same sex will become a kind of, there is a morality of ends there where if you think otherwise, if you think that, that gay sex is morally illicit, you will be, again, sort of pushed, the force of law eventually comes in as it did with race. Or you don't think that'll happen?
Well, I think that there are clearly some on the pro same-sex marriage side who would like to see the liberal state do that, to say that basically say that the Catholic Church must sanctify gay marriages.
Well,
but I am opposed to that and think it should not do that, and not just that, but other issues that are not quite as inflammatory. I agree with you. Maybe in the end it won't happen, but my vision of the liberal state, it would attempt to be more neutral than you're claiming.
Right.
There are some debates that never end that are bad debates. This was a good debate that wants to continue. I was looking for a passage in Damon's book that could all bring us together in conclusion, and I found one
Wow.
at the end of his chapter on the intolerance of freethinkers. And so I will read two sentences to close. The last thing America needs is a war of attrition between two mutually exclusive absolute systems of belief. What America needs now is not absolute faithlessness, it is intelligent faith and open-minded doubt. And I think that's what we got today, and I thank you all very, very much.